Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
It's good to be here.
How are you doing? Ready for this one? Because I feel like this topic it's huge.
I am, yeah. This is a big one. It's absolutely foundational. We're stepping onto the bedrock of human social structure.
The family unit.
Yeah.
And our mission today is really to look at it not just as a cultural tradition, but as a biological requirement for our very existence.
That's exactly it. We have to see the family as an evolutionary necessity.
Yeah.
It's the prerequisite for human beings to even flourish in the first place.
And to do that, we have to start with a pretty brutal, simple truth about our species, don't we?
We do, which is that we are, biologically speaking, incredibly fragile. I mean, we're born naked, defenseless. A newborn foal can walk within hours. A human infant requires years of total absolute reliance on others.
So survival for Homo sapiens always depended on organizing into a committed, protective group.
The family. Whether that was nuclear or extended, it was the only way to get security, warmth, food. It was the original evolutionary contract.
And without that unit, the whole human experiment would have just ended.
It would have, but its function goes way beyond just physical security.
Yeah.
It's the infrastructure for everything that comes next.
Right. So beyond just keeping the baby alive, there are these critical secondary roles. You talk about something called habitus formation.
Yes.
That's a term we should probably unpack a bit.
Think of habitus as the invisible operating system that gets loaded onto a child. It's that initial microenvironment. It shapes our unconscious behaviors, our values, our emotional reactions to things.
So it's how culture gets transferred.
It is. It's not just knowledge, it's the grammar of how to live. This is what makes a child a functional member of society.
What's so fascinating is that the need for this system is constant, but the definition of what the family looks like has been, incredibly fluid through history.
Wildly fluid. I mean, if you look at, say, certain periods in Roman history, a father had the power of life and death over his children.
Which is just horrifying to think about now.
It is. Leaving an unwanted infant exposed was, in some contexts, a normalized social dynamic. So that tells you the need for structured care is non-negotiable, but the rules, the cultural rules, are entirely changeable.
And that's the key to the modern tension, isn't it? Because over the last maybe 20 years, we've seen this push against the traditional idea of family. They're shrinking, becoming atomized.
And sometimes framed as an obstacle.
Exactly, an obstacle to individual freedom, which leads to the big question, can we just get rid of it?
And the biological answer is a hard no. And that's because of what we call the zero-kilometer brain.
Okay, explain that. The zero-kilometer brain.
A human is born with a brain that is profoundly underdeveloped. It's like hardware that's useless without software. And that software has to be loaded by constant, rich social input.
From day one.
From minute one. We have the longest childhood of any animal because our brains are designed to be molded by our immediate social environment. That family structure is the input mechanism. If you don't get that, the neurological damage can be permanent.
So it's not just a nice custom to have, it's a developmental necessity for our brains to even work properly.
Precisely. You cannot bypass that stage.
This necessity leads to some very powerful language. People often call the family sacred, but you've argued that word is problematic.
It is. Because if you take sacred literally to mean clean, spotless, pure.
Right.
Well, nothing human is that. Families are made of flawed, messy, emotional people. They are inherently imperfect.
So you set it up for failure with that standard.
You set it up for disillusionment. We need more pragmatic view. Sacred in this context is really used in a worldly sense to mean something of the highest value, something we decide is worth protecting.
And if we use that definition, it fits.
It fits perfectly because its functional power is immense.
And we can prove that value with psychology, with attachment theory.
That's the scientific anchor right there. Attachment theories show, conclusively, how that early emotional bond with the primary caregiver dictates all of our future relationships.
Not just with partners, but with ourselves.
Especially with ourselves. It sets the blueprint for our self-worth, for how we regulate our emotions, for our ability to trust. It's astonishing, really.
That a few years can set the trajectory for a whole lifetime. So the high value isn't some abstract moral idea. It's a recognition of its raw power to shape who we are.
It's the single most critical psychological shaper in a person's life, which is why we have to distinguish that universal psychological need from, some of the cultural stories that can be dysfunctional or repressive.
And that power, that intense shaping, brings us right back to that core tension. If family creates the individual, doesn't it also have to restrict the individual?
That's the eternal struggle, isn't it? The individual versus the structure. And we have to admit, yes, family can be restrictive, it can be controlling, but its primary function is still to create the individual.
And the best way to grasp that is with that thought experiment you use.
Right. So for anyone listening, just pause and imagine this. You have your exact same genetics, but you were swapped at birth and raised by the family next door.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. Their way of arguing, their sense of humor, their anxieties, all loaded onto you. The person you call I simply would not exist.
That's genuinely a terrifying thought. It shows how much of our self is actually constructed by that microculture.
It is. We are beings who cannot survive without taking a specific social shape. We need that environment.
Yeah.
We've seen in cases of extreme neglect, children don't even develop language. The brain hardware is there, but without the social input, it doesn't activate.
So getting rid of the family structure, there's no plan B.
There's no plan B. It just creates a vacuum.
Yeah.
A vacuum of meaning, of development, of safety that nothing else has ever been able to fill.
Okay, so if it's irreplaceable, the conversation has to be about adaptation. I mean, an 18-year-old who's financially independent doesn't need their family in the same way a toddler does. So how flexible is this system?
It's historically been very flexible. We've gone from hunter-gatherer groups with communal care to agricultural families to the small mobile and nuclear family of today. The structure always molds itself to what's needed for survival.
So why is there so much conflict now? You call it a clash with our factory settings.
It's a factory settings conflict, exactly. Civilization moves incredibly fast. It demands dual-income households, people moving for jobs, having kids later. But many families are still trying to run on 19th century cultural software.
Like rigid patriarchy or certain ideas about gender roles?
Precisely. And when those old stories, those old customs clash with the reality of modern life, the whole system comes under immense stress. It becomes dysfunctional.
So the social values have to evolve. Rigidity is basically a pathology.
It is. A social structure has to serve the people living in it now, not the people who lived 100 years ago.
And even when a person becomes an adult, that dependency, it doesn't really go away, does it? It just changes.
It transforms into a psychological need. It becomes like a psychological hothouse, an emotional safety net. It's the place you lean on, often without even realizing you're doing it.
The anchor.
The absolute anchor. And for many people, the true weight of that is only felt when it's gone, when a parent dies. That tether is a spiritual reliance, not a financial one.
You actually mentioned an anecdote about that, the Danish professor. Her daughter moved out, started her own family.
And she grew psychologically closer to her parents.
How does that work?
Because the family is an expanding concept. Once the daughter was creating her own habitus for her own children, she gained a new, profound appreciation for the one her parents built for her. The bond shifted, and in many ways it deepened.
Of course, we have to acknowledge the dark side, too. The pathological patterns, the obsessive control, forcing a child into a career to, uphold the family name.
And those are the results of those dysfunctional cultural scripts we're talking about. The system is vital, but its execution can be incredibly harmful when it's based on fear and unexamined inherited rules.
Let's talk about those rules. How are the duties of mothers, fathers, and kids actually determined? Is it biology, or are we just acting out a learned script?
It is overwhelmingly a learned performance. The roles are shaped by cultural teaching, by imitation. We just repeat the patterns of our own parents, completely unconsciously, until something forces us to stop and actually think about it.
It's often said an experienced observer can look at a child's behavior and pretty accurately describe their parents without ever meeting them.
That is absolutely true. A child's emotional triggers, their coping mechanisms, their dysfunctions, it's all a direct reflection of the family's microculture. That pattern was loaded onto them.
Now, culture is the main driver, but you've said there are some consistent biological tendencies that we see across cultures.
Yes, subtle but consistent. Globally, the mother tends to engage in constant, close verbal communication. This is a huge support for language development. The father, on the other hand, often tends more toward physical rough-and-tumble play.
Modeling how to manage emotions in the wider world.
Exactly. Interaction with the world beyond the immediate home. But again, these are tendencies, not iron laws. And they are all subject to learning.
And the science on learning is so clear here. The mouse experiment is a perfect example.
It's a critical piece of evidence. Researchers took pups from poor caregiver mothers, ones who didn't lick or care for them much, and gave them to good caregiver mothers.
And what happened?
The pups grew up to become good caregivers themselves. It proved that this complex, fundamental behavior is learned. It's passed down environmentally, not just genetically.
So for humans, with our complexity, the learned part must be exponentially more important.
Infinitely more important, which is why I completely reject the idea that we can somehow engineer a synthetic replacement for the family.
The historical attempts have been disastrous.
They've been damning. That experiment in 1930s Poland, they separated children from parents to try and create this idealized communal upbringing.
And the results were catastrophic.
Absolutely catastrophic. They had food, they had shelter, but they lacked that essential personalized emotional input, that dedicated affection. It led to profound psychological damage, failure to thrive, and tragically high mortality rates.
It shows there's a subtle, irreplaceable scaffolding that the family provides.
It's something that can't be standardized in an institution. We just don't understand human dynamics enough to play God like that.
So if we can't replace it, and we know it's essential but flawed, what's the most effective strategy for the next generation?
The strategy is almost profound in its simplicity. We invest in the happiness, health, and well-being of mothers and expectant mothers.
That's the single highest leverage point.
It is. A happy, supported, healthy primary caregiver leads to secure attachment. Secure attachment leads to better developmental outcomes. Better outcomes lead to better functioning adults who become better parents themselves. It's a virtuous cycle.
So the strategy isn't to engineer something new. It's to preserve the essential function of this institution, but have the courage to strip away the dysfunctional cultural scripts that cause all the conflict.
Reformulate it. Don't abolish it. That's the only logical path.
So we've established that the family is this fundamental unit that literally shapes the self. It's an inescapable blueprint that balances restriction with the necessity of creation.
And we can end on that idea of functional value. The family isn't sacred in a pure, spotless sense, but it is crucial. Its power is immense. It can elevate a person, or it can utterly ruin them.
That's a powerful final thought.
And our focus has to be on recognizing that importance, and that continuously having the courage to reformulate its rules for the maximum benefit of the people living today. That's the responsibility of every single generation.